United States, Project MKUltra. In the United States, one of the darkest chapters was known as Project MKUltra. This was a secret CIA program during the Cold War, designed to test mind control and interrogation techniques. Between the 1950s and 1970s, experiments were carried out on thousands of people, often without their consent. College students, hospital patients, prisoners. Some were given LSD and other drugs, others were subjected to sleep deprivation or hypnosis, all in an attempt to manipulate the human mind. For decades, the government denied these claims. Whistleblowers and journalists were called conspiracy theorists. But in the 1970s, documents were finally declassified, proving that MKUltra had been real. Even then, most of the files had already been destroyed, leaving only fragments of the full story. To this day, the CIA insists that the project was abandoned and that no similar research continues. But for many Americans, MKUltra represents a terrifying truth, that their own government once treated citizens like test subjects in a science experiment, and the full extent of what happened may never be known. Germany, Aktion T4. Germany is remembered for the horrors of the Second World War, but one secret remained hidden for years, even after the war ended. Before the Holocaust began, the Nazi regime carried out a program known as Aktion T4. It was a systematic plan to kill people with physical and mental disabilities, who were labeled as unworthy of life. Beginning in 1939, thousands were taken from hospitals and institutions, transported in buses with sealed windows, and murdered in specially built gas chambers. The program was officially stopped in 1941, but in reality, killings continued in secret until the war ended. After 1945, this part of history was rarely spoken about. Many families did not even know what happened to their relatives. For decades, there was silence. Only later did Germany fully acknowledge Aktion T4 as the true beginning of mass murder under the Nazi regime. International historians see it as the direct blueprint for the Holocaust, while within Germany, it took many years before official memorials and public recognition appeared. Today, the country confronts this dark legacy openly, but Aktion T4 remains one of the most disturbing secrets in modern German history. Japan, Unit 731. During the Second World War, Japan's military established one of the most notorious secret facilities in human history, Unit 731. Located in occupied China, this unit was disguised as a research center. In reality, it became a site of horrific human experimentation. Prisoners of war and civilians were exposed to biological weapons, forced infections, frostbite tests, and even live dissections. Thousands died in silence, and the details were hidden from the public for decades. After Japan's defeat in 1945, most of the evidence was destroyed. Many of the doctors and officers involved were never punished. In fact, some of them were secretly granted immunity by the United States in exchange for sharing their research. In Japan itself, the story of Unit 731 was rarely taught, and many survivors were silenced by fear. Internationally, historians describe Unit 731 as one of the darkest war crimes of the 20th century. In Japan, however, it remains a painful and controversial subject. Some deny the scale of what happened, while others push for full recognition and remembrance. Russia, the Katyn Massacre. In 1940, deep in the forests near Katyn, thousands of Polish officers, intellectuals, and prisoners of war were executed by the Soviet secret police. For decades, the Soviet Union denied responsibility, blaming the Nazis instead. The truth was hidden, families were silenced, and speaking about Katyn was considered dangerous. But survivors and Polish communities abroad never stopped pushing for answers. International evidence pointed to the Soviets, yet Moscow refused to acknowledge it. Only in 1990 did Russia finally admit that the NKVD had carried out the killings. Even then, debate over responsibility and intent continued. Today, Russia recognizes Katyn as a tragedy, but avoids the term genocide, while Poland and much of the world see it as one of the clearest examples of Soviet war crimes. China, Tiananmen Square. In 1989, thousands of students and citizens gathered in Beijing's Tiananmen Square, calling for reform, freedom, and an end to corruption. For weeks, the protest remained largely peaceful. But when tanks rolled in on June 4th, everything changed. Gunfire echoed through the city, and civilians were crushed or shot as the military cleared the square. Western media broadcast images of the crackdown, including the now iconic photo of a lone man standing in front of a tank. Internationally, it is remembered as one of the darkest moments in modern China. Inside China, however, the story is different. The government describes it as a necessary step to restore order, and most details are censored from public view. If someone searches on Chinese platforms for terms such as Tiananmen, June 4th, or related images, they will usually find no results or only official state-approved content. The true number of deaths remains unknown. France, the Algerian War. From 1954 to 1962, Algeria fought for independence from France in a brutal conflict that left deep scars on both nations. French forces used torture, mass arrests, and executions, while Algerian fighters carried out bombings and assassinations. Over 1 million people may have died, though the exact toll is still debated. For years, France downplayed or denied the violence, presenting it as a colonial police action rather than a war. Veterans and survivors spoke of atrocities, but official recognition came slowly. It was only decades later that France admitted to systematic torture and began acknowledging its darker role. In Algeria, the war is remembered as a heroic struggle for freedom. In France, it remains a source of division, with some calling for full recognition and others resisting what they see as an attack on national pride. United Kingdom, the Bengal famine of 1943. In 1943, while the world was consumed by war, a devastating famine struck Bengal in British-ruled India. Crops had failed, but it was the policies of the colonial administration that made the disaster far worse. Food supplies were diverted to the war effort, prices were left unchecked, and entire regions were left without relief. As a result, millions of people starved to death in one of the deadliest famines of the 20th century. International historians often point to the leadership of Winston Churchill, who continued exporting rice from India during the famine. Critics argue that this turned a natural disaster into a man-made catastrophe. In Britain, however, defenders claim the famine was unavoidable, caused by war and poor harvests rather than deliberate policy. To this day, the Bengal famine remains a dark chapter in British colonial history. In India, it is remembered as a tragedy created by neglect and exploitation, while in the UK, it is often overshadowed by the narrative of wartime victory. Australia, the stolen generations. From the late 1800s until the 1970s, thousands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were forcibly removed from their families by Australian authorities. Officials claimed it was for education and protection, but in reality, it was an attempt to assimilate Indigenous people into white society. Children were placed in institutions or foster homes, where many suffered abuse and neglect. For decades, the government denied wrongdoing. Families were left broken, and survivors carried trauma into later generations. It wasn't until 2008 that Australia's Prime Minister issued a formal apology, acknowledging the suffering of what became known as the stolen generations. Today, many Australians see this as the nation's darkest secret, though debate continues about how to repair the damage. For Indigenous communities, the memory of children taken away is not history, it is a living wound. Canada, residential schools. For over a century, Indigenous children in Canada were forced into residential schools run by churches and the government. The goal was to erase Indigenous languages and culture. Children were separated from their families, forbidden to speak their mother tongue, and many faced physical and emotional abuse. Some never returned home. For a long time, the truth was ignored. Survivors' testimonies were dismissed, and the schools were described as places of education. But in recent years, the discovery of unmarked graves at former school sites has shocked the nation. These findings forced Canadians to confront what happened. The government has since issued apologies, and a Truth and Reconciliation Commission has documented the abuses. Still, many Indigenous communities say justice is far from complete. Internationally, Canada is often seen as peaceful and progressive, but the legacy of the residential schools reveals a much darker truth hidden beneath that image. Brazil, the military dictatorship. From 1964 to 1985, Brazil was ruled by a military dictatorship that promised stability but delivered repression. Political opponents were arrested, tortured, or simply disappeared. Censorship silenced newspapers and artists, while surveillance networks kept society in constant fear. The government called it a defense against communism, claiming they were protecting the nation from chaos. For decades, many Brazilians were unaware of the full extent of abuses. Official records were hidden, and victims' families were left without answers. Only after the dictatorship ended did investigations reveal the scale of human rights violations. Even today, some defend the era as one of order and progress, while others see it as Brazil's darkest secret. India, the Bhopal disaster. On the night of December 2, 1984, a toxic gas leak from a Union Carbide pesticide plant in Bhopal turned the city into a nightmare. Thousands died within days, and hundreds of thousands suffered long-term health effects. It is considered the world's worst industrial accident. For survivors, justice never fully came. The company reached a settlement, but critics argue it was far too small. Many families were left without proper medical care, and contaminated water still affects communities near the site. In India, the Bhopal disaster is remembered as a tragedy born of corporate negligence. Internationally, it is a symbol of how industrial progress can hide deadly risks. The government's slow response and the company's escape from full accountability make this one of modern India's darkest chapters. South Africa, the Apartheid Weapons Program. During the years of apartheid, when South Africa was isolated from much of the world, the regime secretly pursued nuclear weapons. At a time when the government enforced racial segregation and oppression, it quietly built a small arsenal of atomic bombs. The project was hidden from the public, and only a handful of officials knew the details. By the early 1990s, as apartheid collapsed, South Africa dismantled its weapons before joining international treaties. It remains the only country in history to build nuclear weapons and then voluntarily give them up. Supporters present this as a responsible act of peace. Critics argue it was part of a far darker plan to maintain a racist regime by threatening mass destruction. The secrecy of the program, combined with the brutal system it supported, makes it one of the most disturbing secrets in South African history.